Well, everybody, thanks for coming. We're on Lesson 10 tonight on the effects of the redemption. And I've been a little bit stuffed up. I'm told it's ragweed season, so my allergies have been bugging me.
Yep, mine are getting ready to bloom.
But let's have a little reading from Romans. This is from chapter 9, verse 25. As indeed he says in Hosea, "Those who are not my people I will call my people, and her who is not beloved I will call beloved. And in the very place where it was said to them, you are not my people, there they shall be called children of the living God." And Isaiah cries out concerning Israel, "Though the number of the Israelites were like the sand of the sea, only a remnant will be saved. For decisively and quickly will the Lord execute sentence upon the earth." And as Isaiah predicted, unless the Lord of hosts had left us descendants, we would have become like Sodom and have been made like Gomorrah. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, amen. So Paul is bringing together some words of the prophets here to remind us that God has truly favored us and chosen us. Otherwise, we would have been destroyed long ago. And I've been looking at various Marian prophecies lately with La Salette and Fatima and Akita. And in all those, Our Lady says that the destruction is coming soon unless you pray. And the destruction hasn't come. So does that mean that our prayers have worked? I suppose, right? And in fact, Our Lady of Akita had a new message, and I didn't know this. Apparently Sister Sasagawa is still alive. And back in 2019 in October, she got another message. And it was, it would be good for you to put on ashes, or something like that. So what happened right after October of 2019? COVID. And I only heard about the message a week ago. So I wish that had gotten out to more people so that we could have understood it was time to do a little penance before this whole thing hit. But it shows that, you know, with the Fatima messages and the other similar ones, Our Lady keeps telling us to pray. And here in St. Paul, it's a little bit, it's similar, where he's saying, keep praying. God has favored you. He will lead you through these present trials. And here we are. We're still able to meet in our churches and study our catechism and have a good old time reading the Bible. So give thanks to God for being so merciful on us. Now, Lesson 10 is on the effects of the redemption. And believe it or not, we are already at question 102. It seems like we've just been zipping through these. And we would ask then, for the first question, which are the chief effects of the redemption? And of course, when we speak of the redemption, we're talking about what Christ did on the cross. He died, he rose again, redeeming mankind through his own blood, as we see. The chief effects of the redemption are two. The satisfaction of God's justice by Christ's suffering and death. So that's kind of the Thomistic understanding that we've settled this debt. And also the gaining of grace for men. So because God loved us, he is now giving us extra graces. I remember a homily by Fulton Sheen, where Fulton J. Sheen was talking about how the baby Jesus lying in the manger with but a single wave of his infant hand could have saved the human race. That's all it would have taken. And yet he did more. Okay, so we see in the suffering and death of Christ, he's gone over and above what was necessary in order to provide us grace. So he's paid the debt, he's also given us more. So I'll read a little bit of the description here from volume 4. An effect is that which is caused by something else. If you place a danger signal on a broken railroad track, the effect will be preventing the wreck of the train, and the cause will be your placing the signal. Many effects may flow from one cause. In our example, see all the good effects that may follow your placing the signal. The cars are not broken, the passengers are not killed, the rails are not torn out of their places, etc. Thus the redemption had two effects, namely, to satisfy God for the offense offered him by the sins of men, and to merit grace to be used for our benefit. Now, the notion of effects are sometimes a little bit hard to see. And I don't know why this happens, but I am continually surprised when prayers are answered. And you'd think after all this time, I wouldn't be surprised anymore. I was just talking to a lady a while back who her family needed to get into a new house. They were moving. The market, as you know, is crazy. Could not find anything. And the whole family is stressed out about it. And I said, and if you're watching, you know who you are. But I said, well, okay, I better say a little extra prayer for that. And then I saw her a week later, and what do you know? They found the perfect house right in the town where they wanted to move to, and it all of a sudden worked out. And so, and whenever that happens, I'm always just surprised. Like, is that all it took? And honestly, I only ever pray about one Hail Mary, because that's about all the time I have. If you ask me to pray for you, I'll try to remember to offer it at Mass, or if I'm having a particularly difficult task to do that day. But right at that moment, I'll say a Hail Mary for the person who asked me, and then I hope, oh Lord, if I remember to pray some more, that's better. But one Hail Mary has usually done it up to this point. Now, so there is an effect between and we see this, our prayer and then what happens in the world. But so often it's in saving ourselves from mistakes, not doing the things that we didn't want to do, and there are those miraculous moments where things happen you did not expect. But the effects of the redemption are just that, and they're echoing all through our lives now, and all through the history of the church. That those graces that Christ won on the cross are still flowing onto us. And as we say a Hail Mary, and Our Father, a Glory Be, ask for the grace of the redemption to be passed on to this situation, and so often that it happens. Now, it might not happen the way you think. There was a story of John Vianney, I think it was. There was a woman she was a well-to-do woman, wanted to come to a retreat that he was doing, but her husband was a virulent anti-Christian. He was an atheist and did not want her to do anything. But she prayed and prayed and prayed. She always wanted him to be converted, but she prevailed upon him to let her go to this retreat. And he finally, at the last minute, relented. She was able to go on this retreat. Now, forgive me if it was John Vianney or Padre Pio. It was one of those holy, holy men. And shortly thereafter, the man committed suicide. Apparently, he threw himself off a dam and drowned. And the woman, bereft with sorrow because her husband had not received baptism or been converted, at the end went to the priest and said, Father, I'm so sorry my husband died. Well, the priest had received a vision that this man, at the moment of his death, had received sufficient grace to repent right before he hit the water. And that was sufficient to avoid hell.
That's Padre Pio.
Was it Padre Pio? There you go. And so, and Padre Pio had all kinds of stories like this. So it can be, even when you don't think your prayers are working, sometimes it's not till the very end or when it's all over, you see how that was working all along. The graces are there. Now, what do you mean by grace? By grace, I mean a supernatural gift of God bestowed on us through the merits of Jesus Christ for our salvation. Now, supernatural is something above nature. It's not so much that it's outside of nature. That's not quite the right way to think about it, but it is above nature. A gift is something, therefore, that God does not owe us. This was one of the revelations I got from reading Thomas à Kempis in The Imitation of Christ. In one of the first sections it says, God owes you nothing. Isn't that interesting? God owes you nothing. Everything you get is a free gift. And if you haven't, you should give thanks for it. He owes us nothing, strictly speaking. Health, talents, and such things are natural gifts and belong to our nature as men. But grace is something above our nature, given to our soul. God gives it to us on account of the love he has for his Son, our Lord, who merited it for us by dying for us. So it's nice to think that these supernatural gifts from God are there, and all we have to do is ask for them. Now, do any of you have examples of the sorts of things that I've been talking about with these supernatural gifts or prayers answered, anything like that that would fit into our discussion here? The fruits of the redemption.
I've I've prayed for people who have been suffering and not necessarily for their healing, but for their being taken from their suffering. And I see that in a different way as being a grace, that they're no longer in that pain. And I've had that several times when the people were in very terrible circumstance of suffering.
You're talking about like praying for the grace of a happy death?
Yes.
That's what I'm thinking.
I like to give grace scapulars for conversion and healing. And
Yeah.
so there was a gentleman, I was very good friends with his wife because our sons were friends. And
So this is the green scapular, and it's something that is typically given to somebody to help convert them, right?
Or healing.
Or
Healing's
healing, yeah.
And so she never really said what he was struggling with, but we assumed it was either alcoholism or depression or something like that. She never said. So before we moved, I gave her one because that's what I love to give to everybody. I started to the Blessed Mother. And it was and I do this all the time. And I'm like, oh, these people are going to think I'm crazy that I do this. And I was like, but I always place another Blessed Mother's hand, and I just, I'm like, does this do any good? Am I wasting my? And then I think it was a year or two after we had moved, he sent a letter thanking me for that green scapular because when she gave it to him, he was already in treatment, saying, I had not only have had a physical healing, but I think I had a spiritual as well. And that made me cry because you don't think about that when you do things. So, anyways.
Yeah, and if there's that little instinct telling you, oh, don't do it, they'll think you're silly. That's not God saying that. When I go to Rome, I haven't been there in a while, I'll try to bring back a bunch of rosaries blessed by the Pope. And my mom started working for hospice. This was back over 10 years ago. But when I got back from my last trip to Rome, I gave her a whole bag of these papal rosaries, and I think they were blessed by Benedict. And so she was giving them out to people that were going through hospice care, even non-Catholics. And she'd say, my son just is a priest and just came back from Rome. He's got a rosary blessed by the Pope. Do you want one? They always said yes. No one ever turned it down and some of them would think it was the best gift they've ever had. And some of those rosaries only cost me $1. It wasn't anything super special, but because of the where it came from, this idea that there are prayers attached to it was very significant. Many of them really like doing that. What about the back row? Any examples of a prayer answered or anything?
Going to Medjugorje, and we had news that my sister-in-law had like stage 3 colon cancer, and she had to go through chemo and all this stuff. But I took a picture of her. Actually, my other sister-in-law had just had a stroke. But I took their pictures and I put them by the Blessed Mother's statue on Apparition Hill. Mm-hmm. And my one sister-in-law with a stroke, she hasn't come all the way back, but she's talking, and she, she's in a wheelchair, but she do a lot of stuff in her kitchen and everything. And my other sister-in-law, it's just like, poof, is gone. Wow. And then on the trip that we were, Peg Gerkens were with, when Patty and John, my sister-in-law Patty, had stage 4 cancer, top of each lung was removed. She had a tumor in the base of her brain. She had something else. She was like totally healed.
Right. She is really
totally healed. And she just came back and having rosary nights and stuff like that in her garage. They have like people from the parish, the family. They have like 50 people in their garage.
Oh, yeah.
My brother put a TV in there with the words of the songs. And
she's really charged up.
It's amazing. So it's good, and when those things happen, don't forget to give thanks.
Yes.
If I tell someone tells me a great story like this, I say, get to church as soon as you can and tell God thank you. Do something to show thanks. It's important. So question 104 then, how many kinds of grace are there? There are in fact 2 kinds of grace, sanctifying grace and actual grace. But Father, what are those? Well, sanctifying grace is that grace which makes the soul holy and pleasing to God. Sanctifying is making us holy by cleansing and purifying our souls. Sin renders the soul ugly and displeasing to God, and grace purifies it. Suppose I have something bright and beautiful given to me, and take no care of it, but let it lie around in dusty places until it becomes tarnished and soiled, loses all its beauty, and appears black and ugly. To restore its beauty, I must clean and polish it. Thus the soul blackened by sin must be cleansed by God's grace. If the soul is in mortal sin, altogether blackened, then sanctifying grace brings back its brightness and makes it pleasing to God. But if the soul is already bright, though stained or darkened a little by venial sin, then grace makes it still brighter. And that sanctifying grace can sometimes look like a privation or a difficulty. Sometimes when someone goes through an illness, or maybe they lose a job, or they are put into poverty or something, that is an element of sanctifying grace to make us think about the things that are really important. And if you talk to people that have gone through a difficult trial and ask them, would you go through it again? Oftentimes they say yes, because it taught them to become a better person. Now there are some things that there are a few things I can think of I would not want to go through again, but sometimes, yeah, I realize, that time of hardship or that time of hunger, that was really good for me. I'm glad I did that, because now I know what I'm capable of. It's like they say, there's never a shortage of people who are trying out to be a Marine, but they don't take everybody, but it's hard to get in, and people want to push themselves and try hard to see if they can make it at that level of competition, or even professional sports. You really have to push and work and do things very, very hard to get to the highest levels. And sanctifying grace is much like that. What I remind people, though, is that if you pray for sanctifying grace, it's usually a good idea to pick up your own cross. Because if you ask the Lord to give you a cross, it's usually a bigger one. So decide on your own cross first. I'm going to try this one, Lord, and He's usually happy with that. If you ask for one, it's often very weighty. And that's another thing where I see with answered prayers during Lent. I'll kind of see how long I can do it. I'll say, Lord, please send me a cross for Lent. And I'll see how long I can bear it, because usually within seconds, there's a phone call or an email or some disaster, some awful thing is happening. And, I'll bear it as long as I can and say, Lord, I need you to carry this cross back for me. It's too heavy. And then like that, sometimes it's gone. So it's an interesting spiritual exercise to take up those crosses and see how you can do with them. But that sanctifying grace is always polishing us and bringing us into more cleanliness. So the question 106, what do you call those graces or gifts of God by which we believe in Him, hope in Him, and love Him? Remember that we have the act of faith, hope, and love. They're actually in the opening of our Manual 1, I believe. Or Manual 2, sorry. Those graces or gifts of God by which we believe in Him and hope in Him and love Him are called the divine virtues of faith, hope, and charity. Now, in the last few weeks of the bulletins at the parish, I've been running the lists of all the virtues. And so there are the three divine virtues, faith, hope, and charity. But there are more. There's patience, fortitude, wisdom, hope. And in those are broken down into further. I think there were like 72. And if you go through all those, you see how, when you say faith, well, what does faith really mean? How do I break that down and express that in my life? And sometimes seeing the opposite helps you understand what it really is. So the virtues are habits of doing doing good. So the idea is that it becomes a habit so much in that you practice it without even thinking about it. If someone has a habit of driving too fast, they just drive too fast. They don't think about it. They don't get in the car and say, I'm going to go 20 over today. They don't say that. They just get into the habit and off they go. Likewise, with virtue, we can do the same thing. So we have to train the virtue so that it becomes habitual, that I like doing difficult things. I like practicing patience. I like having hope, rather than the typical things of the instant gratifications that we so often go to. So a virtue takes a lot of time to build up, but if you do it carefully every day, eventually you get there. So then we're going to break down faith, hope, and charity individually, from 107, 108, and 109. Question 107, what is faith? Faith is a divine virtue by which we firmly believe the truths which God has revealed. So in a way, faith is a reaction. You're presented with truths, and then you have the faith to accept them. So you are presented with the Bible or the Catechism or a moral truth, a moral teaching. And then faith means that you are going to believe in them. You take them into yourself and then live your life by those virtues. I remember having a conversation with a man who had a very hard time with the church's stance on artificial contraception, we'll say that. And he did not understand it, did not believe it, but he said, well, the church teaches it, so I'm going to pray on it, and pray on it, and pray on it. And he said, Father, it took a couple of years, but after some prayer, and some actually looking into the issue, I understood the church's teaching on artificial contraception, birth control, all those things. Now I understand it, and I believe it, and I practice it. So it took him some time to get there, but he eventually got there. We might do the same thing as children with the Eucharist, for instance. So some children, when they're approaching the Eucharist, they will just see it as a cup and bread, and or the cracker, whatever they call it. And we tell them it's the body and blood of Christ. And some of them get it on the first day, but not all of them. Sometimes that's something that comes later. I've had some kids tell me that, when they are getting ready for marriage, that after they got their first communion, they never went back to church again until confirmation. And then again, when they started dating this gal, turns out she goes to church every Sunday, and then he started going with her. He finally understood what the Eucharist was, and now it goes every Sunday. So sometimes that understanding of that belief in the Eucharist takes time to develop as well. But belief is, you take it in, you hold on to it, and now you practice it. It's a response to God. Now, what is hope? Hope is a divine virtue by which we firmly trust that God will give us eternal life and the means to obtain it. Now, hope is a response to something we do not yet see, because we do not yet see heaven, or we do not yet see what salvation looks like. So hope means that even without having seen heaven, or my ultimate salvation, or like I wasn't there 2,000 years ago at the crucifixion or the resurrection, I have to have hope that it is there waiting for me after I die. So in a sense, hope is believing in something that you have not seen yet. Question 109, then what is charity? Charity is a divine virtue by which we love God above all things for his own sake, and our neighbor as ourselves for the love of God. So now this too is a response, but it's a response to our God and our neighbor. So when you think about the relationship we have with God in prayer, that has to be imbued with charity. That you're not constantly sitting there telling God how he got to do his business and demanding all the things that you want and telling him all the things you didn't get when you were a kid, so how bad you are. Your prayer life should be infused with charity because you are encountering God in prayer and trying to build a relationship. If you want to build a strong relationship with somebody, you don't just start off with telling them all the things that they did wrong, right? So you start with something that is loving. And then from there, hopefully you can work out your problems, but in a situation that is infused with charity. Likewise with our brothers and sisters, that we love our neighbor, and we're actually doing things that will be good for them. And I'll read a little note here about we love them as ourselves. Not with as much love, but with the same kind of love. That is, we are to follow the rule laid down by our Lord. Do unto others as you would have others do unto you. Never do to anyone what you would not like to have done to yourself, and always do for another just what you would wish another to do for you, if you were in the same position. Our neighbor is our equal and gifted with all the gifts that we ourselves have. When we come into the world, we are all equal. We have a body and a soul with the power to develop them. Money, learning, wealth, fame, and all else that makes up the difference between men and the world are acquired in the world. And when men die, they go out of the world without any of these things, just as they came into it. The real difference between them and the next world will depend upon the things they have done here, good or bad. Now, this is an interesting topic to bring up because our society right now is obsessed with equality and social justice, right? We hear it in the news all the time, whether it is the Black Lives Matter or Blue Lives Matter or All Lives Matter or any number of discussions about racial equality in the world. I think it is fair for us to ask ourselves, is this something that we truly believe? So, for all of you who have been around a little longer than I have, what is your impression of how our culture has developed with the cause of racism, justice, equality, those sorts of things? And now let's try to keep the most hyped things in the news out of the picture, but in general, where do you all think that we're at?
Well, most of the time, I think they bring the topic up, but they don't really want the answer.
Right.
The subject is brought up, but there's nobody that really goes to the subject or to the belly of the issue. They talk about racism, but they don't really talk about what it's like to have lived through it as a black person or as a Hispanic or Vietnamese or any other race, even the white people being poor. They don't want to talk about the poorness. The same with the military issue that's going on right now. They don't want to talk about the flub-ups. They avoid that issue.
What about our progress over the decades, though? What do you think back there?
You know, sure, we all know that there was racial prejudice, that, you know, we think of a segregated South, you know, separate drinking fountains, back of the bus, all that kind of stuff. We all know that that's totally unjust.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you pass laws for equality, which is different than equity, I mean, for human rights for all, okay? But there were, I think, self-serving politicians and whatever other group that really did not help minorities or people who had been oppressed or whatever. You keep, rather than help them and build them up and, you know, really educate, encourage, and all this stuff, you keep them, like, focus on the past, focus on that, you know, your ancestors were slaves, and focus on all the, you know, hatred, basically, for people who, like, my God, I mean, we weren't, you know, my family never was a slave, or whatever, but you keep kind of like, well, look what they had. They had all you know, the white privilege and all that stuff. But you keep those, there's like politicians that would keep them dependent, keep them tied to the government, you know, rather than build up families so that family unit, you know, men can support their families.
Right, so there might be a desire for racial equality, but oftentimes when larger organizations get in the middle of that, whether it's a government or any other organization, it tends to throw a wrench in the works.
It's on both sides.
It doesn't allow it to organically develop.
Right, it's on both sides.
Because when I was growing up in Iowa in the 80s and 90s, I really feel like we were a post-racial culture. There were black kids and Hispanic kids in my high school, and it was never really an issue. I don't remember it ever even being discussed. It was odd then when I got here to the 2020s, and now it's the biggest issue on the board. I would have never thought we'd get back there. What about China? Were you from China?
Yes.
Yeah. Are racial issues there similar to anything we see in America, or what's the?
As far as I remember, it's like maybe this is 40 years ago.
Okay.
So, I mean, my memory serves that I don't think there's a whole lot of racial issue because 95% of the because the other 5% are minorities, and there are 56 of them, like 55 plus the one majority. So there are 56 ethnicities in China.
Mhm.
So we learned early on that everybody's considered Chinese.
Mhm.
And then within the Chinese nationality, you have different ethnic groups. So from a race standpoint, there wasn't a whole lot of racial tension. Trying to address, for example, what you just mentioned about, do I sense any different between when it's back in the 80s versus now? I kind of agree. When I was a kid, growing up in the 80s, I think when I first arrived in the U.S., maybe because I'm ignorant, I don't know, but I didn't feel as much racial tension. Now, kids, from different neighborhoods, we always get in fights, but it's not like you're fighting not because your skin color, it's fighting just because you're kids. But I think lately, with all the racial tension that we're experiencing in society, and I think that it's brought up, you all mentioned that it hasn't been solved. It's still like just as before, nothing solved. I think a lot of people use the racial issue, this is everybody, one, either as an excuse for not doing better, or by somebody using it as an excuse to lead to further power, obtainment of power and corruption.
Right.
So I don't know, like Chris, like you said, it's there, but nobody is interested in solving it, because when you solve it, then they have no excuse, they ran out of reason to further their power. So you just talk about it all the time, but it brought up to awareness, but then nobody is doing anything about it.
And so this is my worry, that if we turn into a post-Christian society, there's nothing hard baked into our way of life that says act with charity. And charity means that you judge a person based on their actions alone, and you don't care about their race, ethnicity, or anything else. It's just how did they act and what did they do. But once Christianity is gone, there's nothing else that's going to guide us in that same realm. Because in humanism, what we've seen in all the societies that have tried it, if you look at socialist or communist societies, or other places like the fascists in Germany, they were really big on racial purity, right? So the only way they could build a solid, strong foundation for their culture was by racial nationalism. And so we had to be able to kill the gypsies, kill the Jews, kill the Catholics, kill whatever group. And only the purebred white race was able to actually be around.
Yeah.
So that's where humanism leads to, is if you don't have religion to fall back on, you got to find some other way to separate peoples or create a nation, and it often falls along racial lines. And we can very clearly see that's where our society is going now.
And the religion during World War II was even wrong in some aspects, because there's a saint that is up he went against the Catholic Church. They wanted him to enlist in Hitler's army.
Right.
And the bishops were forcing him to do that, and he left his family and everything. I can't remember his name.
Yeah, something that we don't really pay attention to in the lead up to in the early years of the 20th century was how closely the church found itself allied to the rich and powerful and those in politics. Yeah. And because they were so invested in going to the big fancy dinner parties and getting a lot of money from the governments, they were not able to then stand up against the government when they started to do bad things. So we think, the church was so strong in the 50s and so strong in the 40s. Well, it was to an extent, but it was also beholden to all these worldly powers. And they weren't able to act with charity.
Isn't that where they're at now, too?
You think, maybe?
I think. Oh, Father.
So, let's keep moving. 111. Is grace necessary for salvation?
Yeah.
Grace is necessary for salvation because without grace, we can do nothing to merit heaven.
Could you pass over actual grace, number 110?
Oh, 110, yeah, you're right. Actual grace is the good one. Question 110. Actual grace is that help of God which enlightens our minds and moves our will to shun evil and do good. So sanctifying grace continues with us But when grace is given just so that we may do a good act or avoid a bad one, it is called actual grace. Suppose, for example, I see a poor man and am able to aid him. When my conscience tells me to give him assistance, I am just then receiving an actual grace, which moves me and helps me to do that good act. So sanctifying grace is something that's going on through your whole life. Actual grace happens in individual instances. Sacramental grace is sanctifying grace given in the sacraments, which contain for us a right to actual graces when we need them. So the Eucharist you received on Sunday is still working kind of in the background of your life. But then when you have a particular need for something, like everyone at work is gossiping, Lord, give me the grace to change the subject or not get sucked into all that gossip. Well, the Eucharist you had is opening up this pathway for the actual grace you need in that moment. Likewise, when you make your confession, Lord, I really need to stop eating Whitey's every day on my way home from work. And so you confess to the priest
It's really a sin.
that you ordered a large and all you needed was a small, or whatever. And you knew you're not supposed to, but you
I had 3 Pepsis this hour.
then when you're driving down Locust Street, white knuckled,
Yeah.
right past, and you keep going, that's your actual grace.
They were helping.
Oh, they're all laughing. Apparently they love it. And you get home
I made
Chris,
it
calm down.
and I'll just eat the Whitey's in the freezer.
one day at a time, sweet Jesus, right?
So yes, grace is necessary for salvation. And 112 is very interesting. Can we resist the grace of God? I've got a good story for this, but let's finish these two out. We can and unfortunately often do resist the grace of God. Grace is a gift. We're not obliged to take it, but God is always offering it to us. And finally, it asks us, what is the grace of perseverance? The grace of perseverance is a particular gift of God which enables us to continue in the state of grace until death. Now, this is an interesting challenge. Most people can go their lives, after marriage, when the kids are grown, without falling into mortal sin. I hear a lot of confessions of people that just come in to confess venial sins. That's fine. But give yourself the challenge of avoiding even venial sin for a week and see how you do. Try it. We have this assumption, there's no way I could ever avoid all venial sin. You can do it. And that's the grace of perseverance.
I lock myself up in my house and not go anywhere and not talk to anybody.
I think a lot of people might have been made saints during COVID because they weren't out sinning. Everybody had
But
to
they
come
were
up.
spending too much on Amazon and they were doing all kinds of
That's true. I'll confess, I was just lazy during COVID. I kept thinking that it's going to open up next week, so why make any plans? It's all going to change next week.
I was really happy.
And it was a year.
A lot of canning done.
The worst Easter ever.
Amen.
Myself,
Oh,
alone in church on Easter
Oh,
Sunday.
no, it was bad. People were getting, and they zoomed it, and they got to go, and they actually got to receive Jesus. It's like, that's not fair.
Wait, what?
Well, it's not happening again. Anyway, let's not get sidetracked here.
Oh.
Okay.
I want to talk about resisting the grace of God. This was a case study we had in seminary, and it was it's a canon law question, and it has to do with confession and the internal and external form. Apparently there was this young man who we have all imagined exists out there, but he was convinced to go to seminary by his mother. He did not really want to be a priest, but his mother was really pushing him to go be a priest. And he was more interested in many other things, shall we say. And as he goes through seminary, though, to make his mother happy. Eventually he's even ordained a deacon. And then it comes to his priestly ordination, and the bishop is laying hands on him. And in his mind, as the bishop has his hands on his head, he's saying, I don't want this, I don't want this, I don't want this, I don't want this. He did not want to be a priest at all. I don't want to be a priest, I don't want to be a priest. So then he's assigned to a parish. He still hasn't got the courage to tell his mother that he does not want to be a priest. So he goes into the parish, gets a girlfriend, seeing her on the side, but apparently preaches a pretty good homily on Sunday. And a year or so goes by, and the girl dumps him. And now he's got no reason left to, he's heartbroken. He doesn't know what to do. Goes and does some soul searching and realizes he actually kind of likes being a priest. And he wants to be a good holy priest now. He's decided that maybe his mom was right all along. The people actually really like him in the parish. The girl's out of the situation. And so he goes across town and confesses all this to another priest. This is behind the screen. This is why I think screens should be mandatory, and it should be the only option, because face-to-face can get you in a lot of trouble. But anyway, he kneels down, confesses this whole thing, and the priest says, well, I don't know what to do. I'm not even sure I can absolve you. So I need to talk to my bishop. So he goes to his bishop and explains the whole situation to him. Now, I want you all to speculate. What could the bishop do at this point? And is the man ordained?
Yes, he is.
Well,
He wanted, but God
what does
told
question
him
what,
anyways.
what does question 112 say?
He resisted. He was resisting the grace. But did he really resist the grace?
He, during the entire ordination rite, he's saying, I do not want to be ordained. If that's not resisting God's grace, I don't know what is. So is he ordained? Say that loud. Well, only God would know, but God's not going to force ordination on this man, and ordination is a grace. So the bishop and the priest determine that he is not in fact ordained. All right. What do you do now?
Go back through the process.
Well, this priest has only revealed this in confession, and the priest and the bishop don't know who it is.
Could you reordain the entire?
You don't know.
No, because if you reordain the entire presbyterate, now you've got a scandal on your hands. Because all the people will be out there thinking, oh, maybe my priest wasn't ordained.
And then my wedding was invalid, or my baptism.
And my wedding and my baptism and all my confessions, because now every confession he's ever heard is not a confession.
Like those priests that were baptized incorrectly.
The priests that were saying, we baptize you in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, all invalid baptisms. Okay, so continue to speculate. They can't ask him his name because the seal of confession is inviolate. He's not ordained. But the priest did tell him, come back here in a week at this time, and I'll have an answer for you.
So does he show up?
So what could happen?
Bishop could show up in the confessional and do
Well, but if the bishop shows up in the confessional, he's going to know who it is. This is one of his priests. And now you've broken the seal. So it was a clever answer they had. So, because you can't break the seal of confession, you can't, the confessor, the confessee, and the bishop, they cannot reveal anyone's identity. So actually the bishop had to write to Rome to ask them for advice. And they sent back an envelope inside another envelope. And in that envelope was only for the bishop. The bishop read it, and it said, give this envelope to the man in the confessional. And so he takes that still sealed envelope through the confessor, gives it to the confessee in the confessional. The guy then opens it up, and it says, be at this hotel, at this room, on this day, at this hour. And so he shows up, waits around for a few minutes, and there's a knock on the door. It's some bishop he's never met. And the bishop says, kneel down, please. He kneels down, and the bishop ordains him, says all the words, and walks right back out the hotel room.
Got goosebumps.
Yep. And now the man goes back to his parish with no one being the wiser. And and the confessor and the bishop never knew who it was or anything else. But somehow the story got out, so we don't know if it's true or not. But it shows, yeah, you can deny God's grace. So if you are, we'll see this sometimes during weddings too, that at the moment of consent,
That's kind of the reason for annulment.
the person will be kind of, well, this is rare that happens, but they'll kind of cross their fingers behind their back and say, and say, I'm not really giving consent because I don't want to marry this person. It's just because we're pregnant and all that. And so, but we say that consent perdures. And what that means is if there is an obstacle or something in the way and the consent was good, as soon as you remove that obstacle, the consent takes place. In a situation like this, sometimes we'll see that the person who was holding back after a couple of years realizes that they are truly in love, and one night gets up, from a dream, kneels down by the bedside and holds the hand of their sleeping spouse and says, I promise to love, honor, and respect you all the days of my life. That's the day of the wedding.
Wow.
That's the day of the marriage. When he finally stops holding back his consent and fully gives it. So grace is a good one to know the effects of the redemption. So we'll call it there. Lesson 11 will be on the church itself.
But see, this is why